It's safe to say that things have changed a fair amount since I first started working on the series around the beginning of December 2022. Not changed within GT7, no, that stayed pretty much the same, bar a couple of minor things that have been altered since I mentioned them. What I really mean is the discussion around racing games in general has shifted drastically in that time. 2023, it seems, is the year of we expect more from racing games, and I'm really glad to see this. I myself am of course part of this as well, but there have been plenty of other creators giving their own thoughts on this topic, and I hope more continue to do so. That video by Racevic I showed before is an excellent deep dive into the state of the genre, from true arcade racers all the way to hardcore sims and everything in between. It should really serve as a wake-up call how behind the times these games really are, not only to the developers and publishers, but the players as well. And that's a key point. We as players should expect more from these games. No, it's not enough that a racing game looks beautiful and drives well. Do you know why? Because it's a game, not a tech demo. It has to work functionally as well as technically. It would be like playing an adventure game and saying, it's so fun to run around and kill enemies and look at the scenery, but not paying any attention to the other key elements like the story, the items, the side activities, the characters, all of these factors which go into making the game a game. Of course, that's not a perfect comparison, as the driving in a driving game does have a larger importance relative to comparisons in other genres, but you can see my point. Unfortunately, those who are paid to review these games often don't. This should go without saying, but don't take mainstream game journalists too seriously. It is a meme at this point, but I find it's even more true with racing game reviews. How can it be that these highly anticipated games come out, whether it's GT7 or Forza Horizon 5 or whatever, they have these glowing reviews as they're seen as near perfect masterpieces, but then a month or two down the line, nobody is really talking about them. The only people who still are those dedicated enough to stick with it, documenting the numerous issues, how the game is flawed, lacking, not enough of an evolution from the previous games, and in some ways, clearly worse. How does this keep happening? To me, it seems as though if a game is anticipated to be amazing, it will be reviewed as such, regardless of the actual quality. Again, nothing new in games journalism, but what can we as players really do? Don't pre-order games for one. GT7 is the only game I pre-ordered since Gran Turismo 5, and I still regret it. Try to avoid the hype. This should be a cautionary tale by now, but given how many times it's happened when looking at video games as a whole, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Still, at least try and wait for a game to actually deliver on what it promises, because the discrepancy can be quite big. And finally, don't listen to games journalists. Not only because they don't often understand what makes a racing game truly good, but because they only get a short amount of time to play a game before reviewing it, and game designers know this. This would explain why GT7 seemed a lot bigger than it actually was, since nobody was expecting it to just end almost as soon as you get into the racing cars. As someone who's been through what most long-term fans would consider to be the decline of Gran Turismo since GT5, I've pretty much seen everything. To summarise briefly, GT5 was massively overhyped due to the numerous delays and wild promises, and had no chance of living up to its expectations. Even still, there were some odd and confusing design choices, like the level system, the GT mode being noticeably smaller, and of course, PS2 era car models. To be fair, the issues for developers working with the PS3 have been well documented, so some of this is understandable. And I know that GT5 was the first GT game for many people and is still fondly remembered. Despite everything, it was still Gran Turismo and understood what that stands for, as well as introducing a few new interesting ideas and full online play. GT6 was just more of the same. It wasn't that ambitious, and almost every issue you could find with GT5 was carried over to GT6, as well as the main GT mode being shrunk even more. Even still, it did have that magic, with a real sandbox vibe, sort of like GT2, given the ridiculous selection of cars and ease of obtaining them. Again, it did have a few good ideas in there, and I believe as time goes on, people will appreciate GT6 even more for being a type of game that basically cannot exist today due to the sheer amount of content. It's what many people consider to be the last true Gran Turismo game that followed the established formula. GT Sport came along in 2017 and then took the formula and threw it out of the window. It was always very clear what GT Sport was, not really a sequel to the previous 6 titles, but its own thing entirely. They could have called it GT7, internally it was even known as GT7 SP, but doing that would have been foolish and misleading to longtime fans, so they were right not to. Sport had a much larger focus on online racing, and with that came a bigger emphasis on more realistic circuits and contemporary racing cars. The classic GT mode wasn't even included, included. In a technical sense though, it was a complete revolution over GT6, and as time went on, Polyphony would continuously update the game, adding much requested cars and tracks, and even an homage to the classic GT modes of the past. You can hear from just those descriptions what that era was like. It never felt as though Gran Turismo was living up to its true potential, and couldn't really commit fully to a clear direction, but at the same time, still making games that felt connected to the past. Except for sport, which was something completely different that divided the fanbase, but was at least new and interesting, and was clear in what it was trying to achieve. GT7 seemed to offer a unified vision of what Gran Turismo should be. On paper it seemed perfect. There was no way they could mess it up because they had so much in their favour. They'd already designed a brilliant baseline to work from with sport, they had all of the classic GT games to draw inspiration from and build upon, they had a fan base which was craving a game of this type after being starved for so long, and what you might forget is that they had no competition, and still don't until the Forza Motorsport reboot comes out later this year. There is no reason why GT7 couldn't have been at least equally good as some of those older GTs. If all they did was copy GT3 or GT4 for the current day, that would have already been better than what they actually made. Not even mentioning the ways in which they could easily improve upon those games. Obviously just copying them to make GT7 wasn't going to happen, but my point is that even putting in less effort, they could have produced a better product. At this point, it's no exaggeration to say, understanding how and why GT7 turned out as it did has become an obsession for me. That's kind of why I made this series in the first place, so I could get these thoughts out of my head and move on with my life. We've now covered the how in excruciating detail, but what about the why? Why did GT7 end up as it did, and what was the motivation? Through making this series, I've heard every possible explanation from people, whether that be in my comments or just anywhere else. GT7 was clearly rushed, and that's why the single player is so lacking. Well, it's been well over a year, and hardly anything I've talked about has been improved outside of the first few weeks after launch. So no, that's clearly not true. GT7 wasn't given enough development budget. As a first-party PlayStation exclusive, I find that very hard to believe, and just looking at the game makes that even harder. Not only that, but when you consider the extremely lavish and highly produced GT Championship live events in which not even the competitors are getting paid, that argument completely falls apart. If there is any truth to it whatsoever, then it would be more a case of Polyphony not using that budget correctly and not prioritising what's most important. They did make the music rally after all, which I've used as a punchline a couple of times because that's all it really is. I can imagine something like it in say GT4, where it'd be viewed as a novelty and a small distraction courtesy of quirky old Polyphony, and initially that's how most people saw it. But when you look at it again in the context of how underbaked GT7 is in so many areas, it really makes you wonder why they spent any time and money on it whatsoever. I've also seen people try to justify why they chose to design the game as they did. It's supposed to appeal to younger players who want instant gratification and access to the fast cars very easily. No, it's aimed towards more mature players who work a regular 9 to 5 and don't have time to slog through long championships and endurance races. This is again despite the older games like GT3 having a complete arcade mode, which granted instant access to a lot of the faster cars and even had its own form of progression. Honestly, all of these seem like excuses to me, and I don't really believe anyone actually has a clue why it truly is the way that it is. I don't fully, to be honest, but through my research, I feel like I've gotten as good a grasp on it as anybody. At least anybody who doesn't work at Polyphony. To understand GT7, we have to understand the man behind it. Kazunori Yamauchi, the tree kicker himself. That is far easier said than done, especially for someone who lives on the other side of the planet and who's never spoken to him, and at this rate probably never will. So whilst we can't understand him truly on a personal level, we can understand him on a professional level from his various interviews and appearances. Of course, Kaz isn't necessarily liable for every design decision, but he does oversee the whole operation and gives the ultimate approval, so he has to take this responsibility. One of the best places to gain a deeper insight on him is the 84-minute documentary about him from 2014. Although it is almost a decade old at this point, it still represents a lot of the same core ideas which we can observe in much more recent interviews and is well worth a watch. His strive for realism above all else, I mean it's in the title, pushing the virtual divide, is clear to see and very obvious if you've seen his games and know the story of Gran Turismo. There's one part that I found quite interesting, where he talked about how as a child his parents would put up sheets of paper on the walls for him to draw all over, and once he filled up the pages they would be taken down and new clean paper put up to replace them. I'm not a psychologist, so take what I'm about to say with that in mind, but it is quite fascinating how these small things when we're younger can have a massive impact on how we are as people when we get older and our general mindset. Understanding this then, it's not so surprising that Kaz ended up as the creative individual that he is, and that seems to be the message that the documentary is putting forward. But a very interesting parallel that I couldn't ignore was how this idea relates to Gran Turismo, pulling it down and then starting from fresh. Sound familiar? Also, how Kaz describes his parents taking down the pictures and replacing them. There's no attachment to him, merely that's done, now on to the next. It's this idea of not putting your previous work on a pedestal, and the description pretty much says this as well, and again is another mirror to Gran Turismo. Sentimentality is very powerful, but it has to be used correctly. It's not healthy to simply revel in nostalgia, trying to escape the present and the future, but at the same time, if you don't learn from the past, you're doomed to make the same mistakes, so you have to keep it in mind. There's another part further in which Kaz muses about car designers pulling from the past for their new designs. I'm going to play this part in full, and as I do, please think about this in the context of Gran Turismo, with the cars being the games and the car makers being Kaz and Polyphony.
自動車メーカーのデザイナーが、何か車をデザインしよう、作ろうと思った時に、何をよりどころにして車のデザインをしていくのかっていうのは、やっぱり常に悩ましい問題だと僕は思います。何だっていいっていう状態からデザインっていうのはできないので、過去にこういう名車があった、ああいう名車があった、こういう歴史があったっていうことをこう参照しながら、それに例えば5%、10% のオリジナリティを加えて新しいものを創造していくっていうのは僕はすごく自然なプロセスだと思うんですね。だから今それが世界中で起きているというのはデザインっていう観点から言うとすごく自然なことだし、車のデザインというのはそうあるべきだと思いますね。
You might be able to see where I'm going with this. Kaz talks about this so naturally in the context of designing cars, and I believe he's right in his assertions, pulling from the past and building on that. But how then did he manage to completely contradict this philosophy with GT7? With GT7, they're not adding something original to the classic GT formula, they're taking away from it. And as I've shown, he didn't even seem bothered to go back to these jewels of the past, instead leaving that for other people to do whilst he continues to rigidly look forward. If you're always looking forward into the future, it can be very easy to lose sight of what's directly in front of you. With Gran Turismo, Kaz seems so preoccupied with looking forward to what Gran Turismo can be in the future and what new possibilities can be discovered that he's lost sight of why most people even played the games in the first place. Despite this, Kaz has always tried to emphasize the importance of the realism and the technology behind it, but this was never the main draw for a lot of us, particularly those of us who started with GT 1, 2 or 3. It for sure plays a role and always has, but this documentary really highlights his obsession for these things. If we refer back to the same interview where he talked about SUVs in GT7, he's also asked about the possibility of Tourist Trophy 2. For those who don't know, Tourist Trophy was essentially Gran Turismo on bikes, and was actually built on the game engine of GT4. The game was very well received, but sadly is yet to achieve a sequel. His response was essentially, we very easily could, but we don't have a control method for bikes that conveys the same feeling as a steering wheel for a car, so until something like that can be developed, we won't. You know, there's a very famous quote by Reggie Fils-Aimé, former COO of Nintendo of America. You might have heard it before.
If it's not fun, why bother?
With Kaz, his mantra seems to be, if it's not realistic, why bother? That's effectively what he's saying here. If that's what he believes, then fine, but what does that say about games with motorbikes as a whole? Should nobody even bother since true immersion is so far away? Was the original Tourist Trophy a mistake? No, of course not. Games are fun. If people want to race bikes in a video game, then those games deserve to exist. Complete realism be damned. It's times like these that I'm truly glad not every game designer is like Kaz. What would the state of video games even look like at this point? Listen, if they actually want to make Tourist Trophy 2 and this is the only obstacle, they should just make it. Loads of people are still holding out hope for it, and I'm sure after 17 years since the first game, they should have plenty of interesting ideas for it. Or they might not, but that didn't stop them from making GT7. From watching the documentary, one thing that's clear is how Gran Turismo is a reflection of Kaz's own interests. From sport mode, which mirrors real-life professional motorsport as Kaz has taken part in, to Scapes, which are an embodiment of his passion for photography and appreciating cars as art. The only conclusion I have is that Kaz doesn't have any interest in those long structured campaigns of the old games, or at least he doesn't anymore. As much as games these days are often designed by committee, it really seems like GT7 has the opposite problem. It's designed purely to his own vision of what it should be, and there's no one who can step in and say, okay, but what about these key features that people loved those older games for? How can we just leave those out, or more often the case with GT7, warp them into something else entirely? All of this has led me to believe that the only reason the older GT games were structured the way they were was because they had to be. In a lot of interviews, you often hear Kaz saying things like, oh, we were limited by this or that in the older games because we didn't have the technology to make what we really wanted, but now we do. When you don't have online play, serious customization, a fully fledged livery editor or photo modes, there are no distractions from the main GT mode. It has to be fully fleshed out with an engaging structure and progression, and sometimes hundreds of hours of content, because that's all there was. They were made out of necessity. I hope that this isn't entirely the case, because that would be quite sad, but given the diminishing importance of the main single player mode from GT5 onwards, the trend is clear. What's also clear is how Kaz views Gran Turismo as not just a game, but a platform for automotive culture. He really wants it to have some sort of higher importance beyond just a game where you have fun driving cars. To a lot of people, driving is a chore akin to brushing your teeth, but with the caveat that if you make a mistake, you could die. Racing games clearly won't appeal much to these types of people, but Kaz seems to have a real motivation to change the discussion around cars, and Gran Turismo is his tool to do that. Being honest, it is quite a noble goal. So on paper, that's not a bad thing, but how he can go about doing that may be. If we go back to that interview where he talks about SUVs, which I'm sorry to bring up again, but it just highlights so many of my points, he seems to have this real urge to represent the changing landscape of car culture by talking about adding cars like these, but he doesn't seem to consider if people would actually want them, would use them, or how they fit into a game like Gran Turismo at all. If GT7 can have racing cars specifically designed for racing on circuits that have basically no purpose within the game at present, then what hope do SUVs have? It's just more pointless bloat that nobody is asking for when you could spend the time adding cars and features that people actually want. But no, we can't have cars like the Toyota Chaser because that's not connected to the future. Kaz, in drifting circles, cars like the Chaser and Mark II are basically God, and they'll probably continue to be for a while to come. You can't say they're not connected, they're not with the times when they categorically still are. The fact that they've lasted so long in car culture should tell you all you need to know, and the fact that people are still asking for cars like these should be an even bigger hint that they are still culturally relevant. The fact that pretty much all of the 90s JDM legends have ballooned massively in value over the past few years, something that you've directly recognised and reflected in GT7, means there's no way that you're not aware of this. Ultimately, this isn't even really about the cars, since if they add one or two SUVs or don't add the Chaser, it's not a big deal, but more his philosophy that really pisses me off. It's the closest thing that I've seen to him giving a middle finger directly towards the fanbase. You can't just decide what's relevant to everyone within the automotive space based on your preconceived bias that everything new is better and everything old is outdated and serves no functional purpose. Ask people whether they want to see a Toyota Chaser or a BMW X8 in their racing game, because you're not going to get the answer you want to hear, not as if that actually matters to you. To try and shape your game around these ideals is incredibly short-sighted. People know what they want from a game like Gran Turismo, and in most cases, it isn't SUVs. But not only can we see shifting priorities within the game, but also Gran Turismo as a whole. Gran Turismo is a brand, no longer just a game, and over the coming years, I believe the brand of Gran Turismo will grow even further, with the games just being one side of it. Gran Turismo has its fingers in so many pies that it's honestly quite hard to keep track of. They of course have the movie coming out later this year, the GT Championships, technical partnerships with Michelin and Brembo, partnerships with Toyota, Mazda, Genesis, BBS, IMSA, Super Formula, Sony AI with GT Sophie, and a bunch more car makers through Vision GT. Of course, a lot of those make sense for a racing game, but a few are questionable. I have no issues with them making a movie, it may even be good, but it's more what that represents that has me concerned. Kaz has said that a big desire to have a Gran Turismo movie is to make more people aware of Gran Turismo as a franchise. Fair enough, but if this becomes a normal part of Gran Turismo, I have concerns that it's going to further reduce the importance of the games, in the same way that adding more features to the games have reduced the importance of the main single player aspect. But that remains to be seen. Anyway, Vision GT is probably the one that I have the most feelings about. I'm planning to make a deep dive into Vision GT as a whole, given 2023 is its 10-year anniversary, but for now I'll just say this. Vision GT is not for us players. It's for Gran Turismo to build and strengthen its relations in the automotive industry and have even more influence, which Kaz clearly desires. The content it produces for the game and the impact it has on us as players is almost irrelevant. Most Vision GT cars serve no purpose in GT7, and neither did they in GT Sport. The brief is to design the ultimate sports car for Gran Turismo, so what the hell is the point of a 1200 horsepower rocket ship that's way faster than any other road car and also has an off-road version? In what universe will this ever fit into GT7? Even with something like GT Sophie, which undoubtedly has the power to make the game better, I still have that feeling of cynical intentions in the back of my mind. The idea that they're again not making this specifically for the players or to make the game better, but rather just to flex their tech with Sony and again build relations in that industry. I'm yet to be convinced that they have a way to make it work in the game long term, but I'd love to be proven wrong. You know, a comment I sometimes get is people saying that Polyphony and Kaz should watch my videos or even hire me. This is probably the best compliment I could ever receive, so thank you very much for all of these. Creating or at least helping to create a racing game is a dream of mine, but it's unlikely that'll ever happen. But somehow what I find even more unlikely is the developers watching and responding to my videos. We're talking about a game and a creator that won't even fix the simplest of issues that could be solved in minutes, even when people are contacting him directly to tell him. Sure, you can't listen to every rando off the street, but in this case it's just so obvious, people shouldn't even need to tell him. Polyphony has been notorious for their lack of communication and not responding to feedback, and that's never been great, but with GT7 it feels like we've reached a tipping point. If the interview from earlier didn't make this clear already, they don't care what you think. Kaz doesn't care, Polyphony doesn't care, Sony certainly doesn't care as long as it gets sales, and frankly, unless there's mass outrage in the vein of last year, just after launch, they have no reason to care. They will only take action if people are burning down their houses. Metaphorically speaking, don't actually do that. Ultimately, if the game were incredible and widely loved by all, then you could argue that communication doesn't really matter, and they would be right to not listen to anyone else. Leave them alone because they know what to do. But GT7 is not that game. It is fundamentally flawed in ways that stand in direct opposition to the games that came beforehand, and makes you question if Polyphony even understands why people like these types of games. But they just continue onwards doing the same thing, blissfully unaware of anything anyone has to say, with the game not being majorly changed since April 2022. It's sheer arrogance. And when you then consider the multitude of minor issues that are obvious to anyone and could be fixed near instantly if they actually cared, it becomes clear that it makes them look not only incredibly stubborn, but extremely inept. It's my belief that the people working within Polyphony are actively discouraged to look at feedback and instead told to just focus on their work. This seems like the obvious conclusion given their action, or should I say lack of action, in the face of what I and many other people, including other content creators, have said. And I kind of hope this is the case, because if it's not, there's only one other possible explanation for this. And no matter how much I dislike the decisions made for GT7, I simply don't want that to be true. Many people absolutely love Gran Turismo 7, and I appreciate that. People play these games for many different reasons, and I'm not trying to take that away from anyone. It's simply that what I personally play these games for, and consider to be the most important aspect of them, is seriously lacking in GT7. So much so that when I think about what GT7 does well, it almost makes me angrier when I consider what it could have been, and what a colossal missed opportunity it was. A comment I also sometimes get is along the lines of, I see where you're coming from, and I agree with what you're saying, but I still love GT7. That's fair enough, but I really do like these comments because it tells me that even within people who adore the game and may have their own biases coming into my videos, they can still appreciate what I'm saying. It's still getting to them on some level. And to me, that's probably the biggest effect I can have with this series. What I and so many others really value about Gran Turismo is clearly not being valued anywhere near as much by Polyphony, and nowhere is this more obvious than with the updates they're bringing to the game. As of writing, the most recent update was in March, update 1.31. Let's dissect it and you'll begin to understand what I mean. Not considering minor tweaks like to the handling model and performance point system, there are three major things I want to talk about. The first are the cars. 5 of them in fact, and a great selection. I have no issues with the cars introduced, the Porsche 904 GTS being my personal favourite that really scratches that itch for me, but of course this will be different for everybody. The second are the new tracks, the words new and tracks being in air quotes. 2 versions of the Nürburgring incorporating a cut through on the GP course to make a shorter variant. This version was in GT5 and GT6, and despite the Nürburgring being carried over in its entirety to GT Sport, this layout was left on the chopping block. 5.5 years after the release of GT Sport, now they finally bring it back to the series. Why the delay? Who the hell knows? And at this point, who knows why Polyphony does anything anymore? It was the same thing with the rotating camera, which was only present in the closed beta for GT Sport in early 2017, and then didn't come back until well over 5 years later in an update for GT7. They just take stuff out with no explanation, and then add it back in with no explanation. Maybe they have their reasons, but we'll never know because they don't care enough to actually tell us. But the thing that really speaks the most to their mindset and lack of action when it comes to some very obvious complaints is the third and final thing: the races they added in this update. 4 of them. 4 races. That was it. In this update, they added more cars than they did races. Even without the context that GT7 is still severely lacking in races and events, it should be obvious why it doesn't make any sense to do this. And not only that, but none of these races are new events, just more races for event types we already have. At this point, I feel like I've already shown just how needed more races and events are in GT7 that serve a wider range of cars and actually give them purpose. The last time a completely new event was added to GT7, it was update 1.25 back in October. Seriously, it's that bad. And aside from the races at the returning Nürburgring layouts, they continue to overuse certain variants whilst ignoring other ones that still barely have any races, or in some cases don't even have any races at all. Take a look at Tokyo Expressway. Before the update, the east clockwise layout already had 3 races, whereas east anti-clockwise had no races. So what did they do? Add a 4th race to east clockwise. It's a similar case with the Porsche Cup race at Kyoto, which again reuses a layout with plenty of races already, whilst a few others still have none. One of the cars added was the 2019 Audi RS5 DTM, which is the first new car to be added to Group 2 since the game released. Considering that, what do you think would be an obvious event to add that has been missing since day 1? As f***ing if. It's like they're trying to do a bad job on purpose. Also, the extra menu featuring the GT500 Group 2 cars doesn't even talk about the actual cars, but instead racing cars in general, which is really odd. Do they have some sort of agenda against these cars and so won't make events for them? Well, actually, it's been proven that's not the case. You see, thanks to Nenkai over on Twitter, we're able to see a few events which are hidden within the code of GT7. These events are for the Red Bull X 2019, a classic car event, an All Japan GT car event, and even a full championship for historic racing cars. Whether these were cut from the game or they're waiting to be added is still unknown, but they were discovered back in November and they're still not in the game. And as Nenkai shows, they seem to be almost completely finished, so there's no reason why they couldn't be added tomorrow. It wouldn't solve the issue, but would certainly be a good start in giving many more cars actual purpose through races to use them in. It's no joke to say that I believe this is one of the biggest, if not the single biggest issue with GT7 at present, and Polyphony are seemingly completely unaware of this. There is no possible way that they could have released GT7 in the state it was, ending after a single championship for Group 3 cars and not having any events for anything beyond that, and not known that people would be pissed off. Of course I was when I finished the game, but I always thought, okay, whatever, they're gonna slowly drip feed the rest of the game to us over time. A scummy tactic, but eventually it'll be more complete. But outside a couple of races for Group 1 cars, they just haven't. At this point, what the f*** are they waiting for? World War III? A nuclear apocalypse? The inevitable heat death of the universe? I don't get it. And furthermore, the races they do add are just the same shit where you start miles behind the opponents and they crawl around the track as rolling roadblocks until you pass them and finish the race. No nuance, no intrigue, no tension, no excitement. But I've got a pro GT driver telling me how luxurious the Toyota Alphard is. Fucking wonderful. In isolation, this doesn't matter, but given everything else, it just shows how far their priorities are skewed with GT7. And yet you still have people praising them. It's like some people's standards in regards to gameplay are so low that they almost don't expect anything when it comes to actual races. In the racing game. Sure, the cars are good, a great selection and very well made, and all as a free update, but if the ecosystem that they exist in barely exists itself, then there's hardly any point for them to exist either. Even I felt myself getting a little excited when I saw the silhouette teaser, but quickly snapped out of it when I remembered the state of the game they're being added to. I've driven that 904 maybe twice, and despite it handling great and being fun to drive, I have no desire to go back and race it because the game gives me no reason to. It says a lot that from my 500 plus hours of playing this game, 300 of that was spent not even driving. Making more events is most likely the easiest, cheapest, and least time-consuming part of making GT7, far easier than modelling the cars and tracks or building an authentic physics simulation. So why they give us even less than the bare minimum when it comes to them is unacceptable, and there is no excuse that can be made to justify this. Oh, and also don't be that guy who says just use custom race, because that isn't an excuse either. Not just because custom race is flawed and broken in so many ways to the point that trying to make a decent race is like trying to pull out your own teeth with a pair of scissors, but also because it's not an excuse for Polyphony to not give us a full game by just giving us the tools and telling us to design it ourselves, despite my best efforts to do just that. This is why I may seem dismissive to things like VR, ray tracing, super detailed physics simulations, and other technical stuff, which is undoubtedly good, because ultimately if the game isn't good, I'm not going to play it just for those things. It still needs to stand on its own as a compelling game to play through. It's sad to believe, but there are people who think that by adding VR, all of my complaints are somehow negated, when in reality it only strengthens my point of view. And that's not even mentioning other aspects of this AAA first-party PlayStation exclusive where they clearly didn't try at all and just kind of hoped nobody would realise. I mean, remember when they tried to have a proper damage model in Gran Turismo 5? After that they pretty much gave up entirely, and now slamming into a wall at 250 miles an hour results in a cracked headlight. Now that's what I call realism. Because of external pressure from car makers, a full damage model with proper deformation is realistically never going to happen again in Gran Turismo, and Kaz knows this, which is why he seems so uncomfortable whenever the topic gets brought up, and you get the feeling he wishes people would stop asking him about it. Even still, that's no excuse for why the mechanical damage is so simplified and again has barely been improved since GT5. People have mentioned that I of course only talk about the negatives of GT7 and hardly ever the positives. The main reason for that is this is a critique, not an impartial review, so I only mention the positives when I can use it to frame the issues. Another reason is that if you want to see people talking about the good parts of GT7, you can basically go anywhere for that. I would just be repeating what so many others have already talked about, and that's not my style, and contradicts why I decided to make videos in the first place. Not to mention the amount of Gran Turismo bootlickers who seem so desperate to praise the game with every small inclusion, regardless if it actually makes the game any better, whilst the most obvious issues go completely unnoticed. I mean, GT7 is still winning awards. Look, I know 2022 was not a good year for racer games, so they're pretty much guaranteed to get these by virtue of just being a Gran Turismo game, regardless of the quality. They are truly meaningless. Despite this, I can't deny that what GT7 does well, the immersion, the simulation, etc., it does incredibly well. And at the same time, when it does bad, it does unbelievably bad. The crazy part is though that what it gets right is typically the hardest part for developers. I don't think there are any other developers that do or can make racing games with the level of detail and precision that Polyphony does. And beyond that, GT7 does have some good ideas. Things like the mission events, which, although not perfect, are designed primarily around having fun, not just showing off its immersion and realism or forcing its sense of higher importance in how it needs to define car culture in your face. Car designers appearing in the cafe to share their thoughts about certain cars is a great touch, and how they just leave it for you to discover is even better. The insights they give often do make me think about cars in a different way, and more importantly, they feel real, because they are. Not like the menu books, which sound so corporate that it seems like they're reading from a sales brochure. The small cutscenes for each championship is a great idea too, although it does feel like they didn't put as much effort in with the final few. But other than these few examples, GT7 is proof that yes, you can in fact polish a turd, and even trick some people into thinking it's a diamond. But when you look at it for what it really is, it's still a piece of shit. What you'll find is a common feeling from the community that they completely f***ed up the easy parts. I'm being 100% serious when I say that I could take a week to sit down and create a blueprint for a game using the same raw assets as GT7 and come up with something 10 times better. I think that most people who loved the older games and understood their appeal could do the same. I'm talking about the overall structure, individual races, events, leagues, opponents, prizes, unique and meaningful challenges, and a rewarding progression to tie it all together. These are the aspects that I believe the fanbase understands far better than Polyphony currently do. I'm surprised people haven't tried to make their own version of a Gran Turismo game yet to show Polyphony how it can be done. If anyone is, please get in touch because I'd love to be involved. What's very clear is that they don't hold the older GT games to the same reverence that the fans do. Where this gets ugly is despite them not really caring about these past games, they very clearly try to cash in on that nostalgia. We saw the obvious iconography in the trailers, we heard how Kaz relates GT7 to those older games in the interviews, and it's all just completely hollow since they didn't deliver on this, and more importantly, they don't even seem to understand it themselves. A great example in the game itself is with the roulettes. GT Sport had roulettes as well, but this is clearly trying to call back to GT3. Sure, that had its moments, but there was nothing like that feeling when you'd battled through a long, tough championship and you come out the other side and end up with an incredible prize car that couldn't just be bought, and in some cases you might not have known was even in the game. You earned it. It was yours. GT7 takes that visual idea and then waters it down and morphs it into something completely cynical, frustrating by design that objectively makes the game less fun for the sake of drawing out the experience in the hopes you'll keep coming back. It's pathetic, and so many things in this game do something similar for other aspects of the older games. They just don't understand, and more significantly, they don't want to. Also, why has nobody who's had the chance to interview Kaz called him out on things like this? Sure, I get that outlets don't want to cause trouble and end up blacklisted, but there are so many ways to approach the subject. Something as simple as, so what was the idea behind the roulette tickets and putting unique rewards behind them, like engine swaps and tuning parts, rather than being able to buy them or win them from events. I personally would love to hear how he could possibly try and justify things like this. We were given a tease of the good times not only by the trailers, but even the intro to the damn game, showcasing races and events that simply don't exist in GT7, not unless you already own literally all of the cars and can then set up something similar as a custom race. You'll sometimes even see races like these in the Attract demo, so these race presets clearly exist within the code, but just aren't made into playable events. Gran Turismo as a series means a lot to me. There were times in my life where Gran Turismo was the only game I played. Since then, I've broadened my horizons, not only with other racing games, but other genres as well. Last year, I became really fascinated with game design. What goes into making a game fun and compelling to play? I've watched countless hours of videos on this topic, sometimes about games I've never even played, and just understanding some of the successes and mistakes of various games that can be seen based on what people expect of certain series and genres. Naturally, I applied this to Gran Turismo and racing games as a whole to understand why those older GT games meant so much to me. By doing that, I really solidified what I want from a racing game like Gran Turismo, and how that contrasts with almost everything GT7 does wrong. If you play other types of games, it'll be easier to understand my complaints with GT7. In some cases, you might dislike something about it, but not fully recognize this until someone actually points it out. It is a balance though. There's no point in making an excellently crafted racing game that has tons of unique and interesting challenges and things to do, with a fun progression, that looks like complete shit and handles like driving emotion type S. That is to say, also complete shit. A game like that would serve as much purpose as GT7, which does the exact opposite. But through all of this, I have mentioned the other sides of the game, things like sport mode, the livery editor, scapes, etc. It might be easy to say that I don't care about them at all and just want one specific thing from the game, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Throughout GT7 and GT Sport as well, I have taken hundreds of pictures both in races and in scapes, and then spent time editing and filtering each of them to my liking. I spent hundreds of hours designing intricate original liveries and honing my design skills. I have dedicated months of my life to sport mode, practicing near endlessly until I reached a point where I was at my peak, when I was racing and sometimes beating the best players in the world. I have done everything there is to do in Gran Turismo. And through all of that, I still come back to the main single player, because that is what made me love cars and love Gran Turismo above all else. The core single player is the heart of Gran Turismo, and everything else in the game should be built around it. But if GT7 messed it up so badly, why do I still play it? Simple, I pretty much don't anymore. The only times I do is to record footage for these videos, do time trials every couple of weeks, and check out the 6 minutes worth of content that they add with every update. But despite that, GT7 still gives me what I want from a racing game better than anything else currently out there. That's because it's the only racing game of its type being made. If you want a game like GT7 that isn't GT7, you have to go back and play the older ones, and that's what I'm currently doing. And since they're so much better than GT7, I have very little reason to play it. If there were current alternatives, then I would certainly have jumped ship by now, but that gold rush of GT-style games from the early to mid-2000s has never seemed further away. How I wish we could go back to the days of the GT versus Forza tribalism. Sure, there are a few people who still think like this, but more than anything, most people just want these games to be good. They don't care whether it's GT or Forza, just make it fun. Will the FM reboot live up to this? I haven't been particularly inspired by what they've shown off so far, just more of the usual peacocking. Look at our visuals, look at our handling model, look at our sound design. That one's a bit more difficult. Given the presence of the now infamous Forza wing, which they showed off so proudly, they seem to lack self-awareness much in the same way as Gran Turismo. We know almost nothing about the main single player beyond one line, so I don't want to judge it too early, because that's what happened with GT7, and we know how that went. So let's just wait and see what they can deliver. Anyway, GT7 clearly doesn't work as a true successor to the previous games, so it really has to be asked, what do Kaz and Polyphony really want to make? If we look at GT7, I think a game which functions as a virtual car museum is probably what they're aiming for, so why not lean into that more? The worst sin of GT7 is that they weren't upfront about what it really is, like they were with GT Sport. If they had been clear that they wanted the game to be this tutorialized tour through automotive history, where you also sometimes race, then fine. We could then judge the game based purely on those merits. Personally, I don't think it does a great job of teaching people about cars and getting them invested either, and there are certainly more compelling ways to do that. But at least there wouldn't be this sense of betrayal. From GT7, you almost get this feeling that it's saying this is what Gran Turismo is and always was, almost like they're gaslighting us, because it obviously isn't. The worst thing I can say about GT7 is that if you're looking for a more complete classic Gran Turismo experience, even GT Sport is better. Yes, seriously. GT Sport, the game that was trying to be something completely different and had its GT mode tacked on the side in an update, which still lacks many of the staples of Gran Turismo, like tuning parts, prize cars, and championships. But what it does have is an incredible selection of events catering to almost every type of car in there, including many of the classic events we've lost with GT7. With the release of GT7, I was so ready to just forget GT Sport even existed, but I'm glad I went back to it because it's actually a lot better than I remembered, albeit not a patch on the first 4 games. And on top of that, you don't have to deal with nonsense like engine swap roulettes and brand invitations. If you want that McLaren F1, but saving up 20 million seems so out of reach, just go to Sport. It's only 1 million. Same deal with many other cars which are far more reasonably priced. Something that GT7 carries over from Sport is the always online aspect of the game, even for the single player, which completely bit them in the ass last year. The explanation has been to avoid people modifying save data that could impact Sport mode ratings, which may have some truth, but I don't think is the full story. It just comes across as unnecessary, since many other online games don't need to do that, and it seems very anti-consumer, but more importantly, means that when they inevitably turn the servers off, GT7 and GT Sport as we know them are basically gone. People have said to me that hopefully they can learn from GT7 to make Gran Turismo 8 a true return to form, but at this point, how many more opportunities do they need? If they couldn't get it right with 7 when they had everything in their favour, will they ever? I hate to be so pessimistic, but I just can't see it. I don't have that faith anymore. Something has to change drastically for that to be the case, because if we have the same group of people working under the same conditions with the same ideology, why would we expect the results to be different? Unless Polyphony accept GT7 as the embarrassing failure that it is, which despite being one of the most anticipated games of 2022, most people have almost entirely forgotten even exists, then I don't believe Gran Turismo can ever truly be good again. If there's any positive, it's that live service games are dying. This is something which again has started happening during the course of me making these videos, and I'm very happy to see. Live services are notorious for stretching out content over a longer period of time to try and keep players invested, and GT7 suffers from a lot of decisions which seem to be based around that. So, maybe things can be better, but that doesn't answer if Polyphony still want to make a proper Gran Turismo game. If, by some miracle, somebody with creative control at Polyphony is watching this video, then this part is directed straight at you. I mean, I know I am just pretending at this point, kind of like how Polyphony pretends GT7 is a proper Gran Turismo game, but it's worth a shot. Ask yourself, what type of racing game do you actually want to make? Because to me, it seems pretty obvious that you don't want to make a game like the older Gran Turismos. And you know, that's fine if that's really true, but just be honest with yourself and your players. So here's the ultimatum. Do you want to try and do those older games justice? really knuckle down and understand what the whole appeal of them was, and translate that to the current day, with all of the advantages and improvements that come with that? Or do you want to do something else entirely? Whether that be a complete reboot of the series, taking it in a different direction, or, people are going to hate me for saying this, but GT Sport 2, whatever it is that you actually want to make and have interesting ideas for, and are committed to following through to completion, that is what you need to do. The worst thing you can possibly do is not commit fully to one idea, because then no one will be entirely happy. Even worse is pulling a veil over everything and just pretending that it's something else, and that all is completely fine. And to be clear, none of this is aimed towards the people on the ground floor at Polyphony who don't have any say in these decisions. They're just doing their jobs and doing them very well. It's simply a failure of the management that GT7 can end up as broken and disjointed as it is, despite having a clearly very talented team at their disposal. I think by now I've made my points. Hopefully you can understand why it annoyed me so much how people would act like microtransactions and the economy were the only issues, and if they fixed those, then it would all be perfect. Not even close. Like I said before, I personally don't agree that these choices were down to greed, but I understand why people felt that way. Even if after all of this you still think that way, what you have to accept is that beyond that, there are so many other flaws and fundamental problems within GT7 that merely shouting about just one symptom of those problems isn't going to achieve anything. But then again, not a lot will. That has to come internally from Polyphony. The case study of GT7 is to me truly unique among video games. Yes, there are plenty of bad and poorly designed games out there, but very often this is due to a few specific reasons, whether it be a rushed development, lack of budget, no creative direction, or being a soulless cash grab made to capitalise on a current trend, but GT7 doesn't fit any of these archetypes completely. Believe me, I would love more than anything for my series to be made irrelevant by them fixing the problems and restructuring the game. Hopefully not straight away, but over time. But that isn't going to happen. Sure, a few things will change, and as time goes on, the series will become outdated and incorrect in a few places, but the issues are so deep-rooted that it can't simply be fixed just like that. Polyphony, you need to look at GT7 with a clear lens. You have a campaign which finishes before it even really starts, a tutorialized snooze fest that gives the illusion of free choice but actually takes all agency away from the player, more concerned with lecturing than being a fun experience. You trivialize car collecting to the extent where it becomes truly meaningless and unbalanced to the point of insanity. How so many cars have no reason to exist within GT7, but easily could if you just added more events, that we ultimately have to ask if you even remember that you put those cars in the game. Your AI is used so poorly that whether the player is crashing at every other turn or putting in the best laps of their life, the result will almost always be the same. They can barely be considered races. They struggle to navigate sections of track which they had no problem dealing with 20 plus years ago, and are so unaware that they can't even begin to comprehend the idea of sportsmanship which you preach to us as players. You've heavily modified some of the most iconic corners from your classic circuits for the sake of a game mode which only a fraction of your players even care about. Your progression can be broken so easily that I can have millions of credits within minutes of starting the game, and can then spend that money to not even have to play the game, skipping most of the races entirely, which is incredible given just how few races you even put into the game in the first place, leaving out so many events which were not only beloved by fans, but would give the cars which you so desperately want us to collect actual meaning in the game. You had reward systems which insult your players and actively wastes their time. A completely unbalanced economy which means that grinding the same few races like it's a full-time job is the only way to earn the most expensive cars. Not even mentioning the less important things which you again pretended to put much more effort into than you actually did, or obviously broken features that you've yet to fix since launch. That is just a selection of the things I've covered in this series. How can you look at any of those and feel any sense of pride whatsoever? This is a game which was billed as a true successor to some of the best racing games of all time. This is the story of how an individual considered as the grandfather of an entire subgenre, a true visionary who arguably changed the course of video game history, show that he doesn't get why people loved his games, and honestly makes me question how those games even ended up as good as they did. Despite all of this, I'm still going to keep my eye on Gran Turismo 7, but I don't expect much, and I don't think that anybody else should either. But for now, all I have to say is that yes, Gran Turismo is still my favourite game. But this, to me, is not Gran Turismo. And it never will be. That's it, we're finally done. Thank you for getting to the end of this video and the end of this series, especially if you watched all the episodes that have come before this. It really has been a great experience and your support means a lot to me, so thank you. I know there's still a couple of things people would want me to talk about that I couldn't fit in, so I'll just quickly summarise here. Split screen isn't very good, as Player 2 has limited options for some reason as well as other issues. Sport mode hasn't evolved much from GT Sports. I don't really play it much anymore, but people have said that the penalty system is still just as broken, if not even more so. Also, I am very much aware of how bad the lobbies still are. I haven't actually used them in GT7, which is why I've refrained from talking about them, but just one look at the known issues page for every update tells you all you need to know. Of course, all of this has been from my experience playing on PS5, but I've been told by many PS4 users that the experience isn't great, with sometimes ridiculous loading times, like in the livery editor, and the game crashing in quite a few places. So, although this is the end of the series, that doesn't mean I'll stop talking about GT7 completely. I still have some video ideas of my own, but I'd be interested to hear what you guys want to see as well. And I've also got plenty of videos lined up regarding the rest of the series, so stick around for those. If you've enjoyed all of this, please leave a like and subscribe, it really does help. Also share this with anyone who you think might be interested. It takes a lot of time and effort to fully produce one of these videos, certainly more than just turning on GT7 and doing a sport mode race, so anything you can do is much appreciated. I have said this is the end of the series, but I do have one small thing coming out soon just to tie everything neatly together, so keep your eyes peeled. Anyway, that's it for now. Professional GT7 complainer signing out. Have a good one.